Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, page 327. Uninitiated adults who might be parked in a nearby mint green advertorial Ford sedan or might stroll casually past ETA's four easternmost tennis courts and see an atavistic global nuclear conflict game played by tanned and energetic little kids. And so this might naturally expect to see fuzzless green warheads getting whacked indiscriminately skyward all over the place as everybody gets blackly drunk with thanatoptic fury in the crisp November air. These adults would more likely find an actual game of Eschaton strangely subdued, almost narcotized looking. Your standard round of Eschaton moves at about the pace of chess between adepts. For these devotees become, on court, almost parodically adult, staid, sober, humane, and judicious 12-year-old world leaders, trying their best not to let the awesome weight of their responsibilities to nation, globe, rationality, ideology, conscience, and history, to both the living and the unborn, not to let the terrible agony they feel at the arrival of this day, this dark day the leaders have prayed would never come, and have taken every conceivable measure rationally consistent with national strategic interest to avoid, to prevent, not to let the agonizing weight of responsibility compromise their resolve to do what they must to preserve their people's way of life. So, they play, logically, cautiously, so earnest and deliberate in their calculations they appear thoroughly and queerly adult, almost Talmudic, from a distance. A couple gulls fly overhead. A mint-green Ford sedan has passed through the gate's raised portcullis and is trying to parallel park between two dumpsters in the circular drive behind West House, which is behind and to the next straining left of the Gatorade Pavilion. There's an autumnal tang to the air and a brittle grey shell of cloud cover, plus the constant faraway hum of Sunstrand Plaza's ATHSCME fan line. Strategic acumen and feel for realism vary from kid to kid, of course. When IRLIBSYR's Evan Ingersoll starts lobbing warheads at SOVWAR's belt of third-wave reserve silos in the Kazakh, and it becomes pretty clear that AMNAT has won IRLIBSYR to its side by making sinister promises about the ultimate disposition of Israel, even though nobody's Israel out there today, seems in a fit of pique to have somehow persuaded SOTHAF, who today is Brooklyn, New York's little hard-ass Josh Gopnik, the same Josh Gopnik, who, by the way, subscribes to commentary, to expend all 16 of its green fuzzy warheads in a debilitating enfilade against AMNAT dams, bridges, and bases from Florida to Baja. Everybody involved orders total displacement of MAMA populations. Then, without any calculation whatever, INDPAK, who today is JJ Penn, a high-ranked 13-year-old but not exactly the brightest log on the Yuletide fire, dumps 3 poorly tied jockstraps worth of MIRVs on Israel, landing most of the megatonnage in sub-Beersheba desert areas that didn't look much different before the blasts. When roundly kibitzed from the shelter of the Gatorade Pavilion under Stitz Tower by Trolsch, Axford, and Incandenza, Penn shrilly reminds them that Pakistan is a Muslim state and sworn foe to all infidelic enemies of Islam, but can do little but fiddle with the strings of his launcher when Pemulus cheerfully reminds him that nobody's Israel today and there isn't so much as a combatant sock on that part of the courts. It is not a matter of the principle of the thing, ever, in Eschaton. Except for the SOUTHAF flurry and INDPAK boner, 11/8th's game proceeds with much probity and cold deliberation, and even more pauses and hushed chin-stroking conferences today than tend to be the norm. The only harried-looking person on the 1,300-meter squared map is Otis P. Lord, who has to keep legging it from one continent to another, pushing a rolling double-shelf stainless steel food cart purloined from St. John of God Hospital with a blinking Yushituyu portable on one shelf and a 256-capacity diskette case about two-thirds full on the other, the shelves side hung with clattering clipboards, Lord having to dramatize manually the effortless dictates of real logic and necessity, verifying that command decisions are allowable functions of situation and capacity. He'd shrug his shoulders, in a neutral whatever, at SOUTHAF and INDPAK, locating necessary data for subterranean premiers and dictators and airsick presidents, removing vaporized articles of clothing from sites of devastating hits and just wapsing them up or folding them over at the sites of near hits and fizzle yields, triangulating EM pulse estimates from confirmed hits to authorize or deny communication capacity. It's a nerve-wracking job. He's more or less having to play God, tallying kill ratios and radiation levels and parameters of fallout, strontium-90 and iodine levels, and the likelihood of conflagrations versus firestones and MAMAs with different mean values, skyscraper heights, and combustible capital indices. Despite chapped hands and a badly running nose, Lord's response time to requests for data is impressive, thanks mainly to the sly DEC hookup and the detailed decision algorithm files Pemulus has authored 3 years back. Otis P. Lord informs SOVWAR and AMNAT that Peoria, Illinois' topographic flatness ups the effective kill radius for SOVWAR's 5 megaton direct hit to 10.1 clicks, meaning half of this MAMPOP burns to death in evacuatory traffic jams out on Interstate 74. An AMNAT Minuteman can hold an absolute maximum of 8 MIRVs, irregardless of whether the Titanic jockstrap little Lamont Chu promoted out of the sedated Teddy Stotts gear bag on the bus Friday night can hold 13 dead tennis balls. Given standard climatic conditions, the fire area from an airburst will be 2 pi times larger than the blast area. Toronto has enough subcode skyscrapers within its total area to guarantee a firestorm of a minimum of 2 strikes within 2 pi divided by 1 divided by total Toronto area in meters square of target center. 5 megatons of heavy hydrogen fusion yields at least 1,400,000 curies worth of strontium-90, meaning microcephalic kids in Montreal for roughly 22 generations. And yes, Wiseacre McKenna of AMNAT, the world will probably notice the difference. Struck and Trevor Axford hoot loudly from under the green Gatorade thirst aid awning of the open-air pavilion outside the fence along the south side of the East Courts, where the pavilion, they and Michael Pemulus and Jim Trolsch and Helen Candenza are splayed on reticulate mesh patio chairs in street clothes, and with their street sneakers up in reticulate mesh footstools. Struck in Axford with suspiciously bracing Gatorades and what looks like a hand-rolled psychochemical cigarette of some sort being passed between them. 11/8 is an ETA day of mandatory total R&R, though the public intoxicants are a bit much. Pemulus has a bag of red-skin peanuts he hasn't eaten much of. Trevor Axford has over-inhaled from the cigarette and is hunched, coughing. His forehead purple. Helen Candenza is squeezing a tennis ball and leaning out far to starboard to spit into a NASA glass on the ground and struggling with a strong desire to get high again for the second time since breakfast, versus a strong distaste about smoking dope with, in, front of all these others, especially out in the open in front of little buddies, which seems to him to violate some sort of issue of taste that he struggles to articulate satisfactorily to himself. A tooth, way back on the upper left, is twinging electrically in the cold air. Pemulus, though from his twitchy right eye he's clearly had recent recourse to some tenuate, which helps explain the uneaten nuts, is currently abstaining and sitting on his hands for warmth. Peanuts on the floor well away from Hal's NASA glass. The pavilion is open on all sides, and compliments of Stokely Van Camp Corporation, and little more than like a big fancy tent with a green felt cover over the expanse as real grass, and white iron patio furniture with reticulate plastic mesh. It's mostly used for civilians' spectation during exhibition matches on the East Show Court 7, 8, 9. Sometimes ETAs cluster under it during drill breaks in the summer, in the heat of the day. The green awning gets taken down when they go into the lung for the winter. Eschaton traditionally commandeers courts 6 through 9, the really nice East courts, unless there's legit tennis going on. All the upper-class spectators, except Jim Struck, are former Eschaton devotees, though Hal and Troelsch were both marginal. Troelsch, who's also pretty clearly had some tenuate, is left eye nystagmic and is calling the action into a disconnected broadcast headset. But Eschaton's tough to enliven verbally, even for the stimulated, being generally too slow and cerebral. Struck is telling Axford to put his hands over his head, and Pemulus is telling Axford to hold his breath. Now, in a stress-heightened voice, Otis P. Lord says he needs Pemulus to real quick come zip inside through the cyclone fence gate south of Court 12 and walk across the theater's 4-court map to show Lord how to access the end-stat calculation that every 1,000 Roentgens of straight X and gamma produces 6.36 deaths per 100 pop, and for other 93.64 means reduced lifespans of total R minus 100 times 0.0636 total R minus 100 squared years, meaning nobody's exactly going to have to be pricing dentures in Minsk, so to speak, in the future, and so on. After about half the planet's extant megatonnage has been expended, things are looking pretty good for the AM-NAT crew, even though they and SOVWAR are SPASX back and forth with chilling accuracy. SOVWAR's designated launcher is the butch and suspiciously muscular Anne Kittenplan, who at 12.5 looks like a Belarusian shot putter and has to buy urine more than quarter annually and has a way more lush and impressive mustache than, for instance, Hal himself could raise, and who gets these terrible rages. But so Kittenplans landed nothing worse than an indirect hit all afternoon, while AM-NAT's launchman is Todd Postlethwaite, an endomorphic 13-year-old from Medina, Minneapolis, whose whole infuriating tennis game consists of nothing but kick serves and top spin lobs, and who's been Eschaton's MLV most valuable lobber for the last 2 years, and accuracy-wise has to be seen to be believed. Still, both sides have artfully avoided the escalation to SAC pop that often takes both supercombatants right out of the game. And AMNAT's president, Lamont Chu, has used the excuse of Gopnik's emotional strikes against the U.S. South, plus Penn's irrational lobbying at an Israel that at the summit was explicitly placed under AMNAT's mutual defense umbrella, has used these as golden tactical geese, tacking up in serious INDDIR points against an SUTHAF and INDPAK, whose hasty defensive alliance and shaky aim produced nothing more than a lot of irradiated cod off Gloucester. Whenever there's a direct hit, Trollsch sits up straight and gets the exclamation he's hit on for a kind of annoncerial trademark. Holy crow! But SOVWAR, beset from two vectors by AMNAT and IRLIB-SYR, whose occasional lob Israel's way, Amnat drawing a storm of diplomatic protest from South Af and INPAC, keeps instructing Lord to log as regrettable mistargetings. Even with cutting-edge civil defense and EMP-resistant communications, poor old SOVWAR is absorbing such serious collateral SUFDDIR that it's being inexorably impelled by game theoretic logic to a position where it's going to pretty much have no choice but to go to SACPOP against AMNAT. Now, SOVWAR Premier Timmy, Sleepy TP, Peterson, petitions OP Lord for capacity authorization to place a scrambled call to Air Force One. Scrambled call means they don't yell at each other publicly across the court's map. Lord has to ferry messages from one side to the other, complete with inclined heads and hushed tones. Premier and President exchange standard formalities. Premier apologizes for the Prince Albert crack. Howe, who's declining all public chemicals, he's decided, has a gander at Pemulus's rough tallies of combatants' INDDIR, SUFDDIR ratio so far, and agrees to bet Axford, a U.S. Finsky, no way AMNAT accepts SOVWAR's invitation to possible terms. During actionless diplomatic intervals like this, Trollsch is reduced to saying, "What a beautiful day for an Eschaton," over and over, and asking people for their thoughts on the game until Pemulus tells him he's cruising to get dope slapped. There's pretty much nobody around. Tavist and Stitt are off giving what are essentially recruiting talks at indoor clubs in the west suburbs. Pemulus would let Tall Paul Shaw take the multi-emblazoned tow truck to take Mario down to the public gardens to watch the public I-Day festivities with the Bolex H64. The local kids often go home for the day. A lot of the rest like to lie in the viewing rooms, barely moving all I-Day until the dinner gala. Lord terrasses back and forth between court 6 and 8, food cart clattering, the food cart which Pemulus and Axford picked up from a kind of seedy-looking orderly at the SJOG hospital that Pemulus knew from Alston, has one of those crazy left front wheels that, e.g., seems always to afflict only your particular grocery cart in supermarkets and makes a hell of a clattering racket when rushed. Ferrying messages which the 18 and under guys can tell AMNAT and SOVWAR are making deliberately oblique and obtuse. So Lord has to do that much more running. God is never a particularly popular role to have to play, and Lord, this fall has already been the victim of several boarding school-type pranks too puerile even to detail. J.A.L. Struck Jr., who as usual has made a swine of himself with the suspiciously bracing cups of Gatorade, is abruptly ill all over his own lap and then sort of slumps to one side in his patio chair with his face slack and white, and doesn't hear Pemulus's quick analysis that Hal may as well give Axe-Handle the money right now because Lamont Chu can parse a decision tree with the best of them. And the D tree is now indicating peace terms in whatever a D tree's version of neon letters is, because the biggest priority for AMNAT right at 1515 hours is to avoid having to SAC POP with SOVWAR. Since, if the game stops right now, AMNAT's probably won. Whereas, if they SAC POP with SOVWAR, trading massive infliction of INDDIR for massive body shots of SUFDDIR, staying more or less even with each other, AMNAT will still be the same number of points ahead of SOVWAR overall, but it'll have taken such heavy SUFDDIR debits that IRL, IBSYR, never forget IRL, LIBSYR, brilliantly, if obnoxiously, imamed today by 11-year-old eyebrowless Evan Ingersoll of Binghamton, North New York, by staying out of the SAC POP Fest and lobbing sporadically at SOVWAR just often enough to rack up serious INDDIR, but not quite enough to piss SOVWAR off enough to provoke the retaliatory SS10 wave. That would mean significant SUFDDIR. Could well have a serious shot at overtaking AMNAT for the overall Eschaton, especially when you factored in the FX advantages for bellicosity and non-existent civil defense. At some point, Axford has passed the remainder of the cigarette back over toward Struck without looking to see that Struck is no longer in his chair, and Hal finds himself taking the proffered Dubois and smoking dope in public without even thinking about it or having consciously decided to go ahead. Sure enough, poor red-faced, runny-nosed Lord is making way too many clattering trips between Court 6 and 8 for it to mean anything but peace terms. Evan Ingersoll is positively strip-mining his right nostril. Finally, Lord stops with the running back and forth and positions himself in the ad service box of Court 7 and loads a new diskette into the Yishichu. Struck moans something in a possibly foreign tongue. All the other upper-class spectators have scooted their chairs well away from Struck. Trolsch extends a blood-blistered palm and rubs the tips of the hand's fingers together at Hal, and Hal forks over the fin without handing the thin cigarette back over to Axford, somehow. Pemulus has leaned forward intently with his pointy chin in his hands. He seems completely absorbed. Interdependence Day, YDAU's Eschaton enters probably its most crucial phase. Lord, at his cart and portable TP, puts on the white beanie, NB, not the black or the red beanie. That signals a temporary cessation of spa sex between two combatants, but allows all other combatants to go on pursuing their strategic interests as they see fit. SOVWAR and AMNAT are thus pretty vulnerable right now. SOVWAR's Premier Peterson and Air Marshal Kitten Plan, carrying their white janitorial stockpile bucket between them, walk across Europe and the Atlantic to parley with AMNAT President Chu and Supreme Commander Pulselwaite in what looks to be roughly Sierra Leone. Various territories smolder quietly. The other players are mostly standing around, beating their arms against their chests to stay warm. A few hesitant white flakes appear and swirl around and melt into dark stars the moment they hit court. A couple ostensible world leaders run here and there in a rather unstatesmanlike fashion, with their open mouths directed at the sky, trying to catch bits of the fall's first snow. Yesterday, it had been warmer and rained. Axford speculates whether snow will mean Stitt might consent to inflate the lung even before the fundraiser 2 weeks hence. Struck is threatening to fall out of his chair. Pemulus, leaning forward intently, wearing his Mr. Howell yachting cap, ignores everyone. He hates to type and keeps his tallies via pencil and clipboard à la Delint. The idling Ford sedan is conspicuous for the excruciated full-color old non-Hagen Esplanade on the green of its right rear door. Hal and Axford are passing what looks like, to the combatants, a suckerless Tootsie Roll stick back and forth between them, and occasionally to Trosh. Trevor, the axe-handle Axford, has a total of only 3.5 digits on his right hand. From Westhouse, you can hear Mrs. Clark and the time-and-a-half holiday kitchen staff preparing the Interdependence Day gala dinner, which always includes dessert. Now, REDCHI itself, quietly trying to rack up some unanswered INDDIR, sends a towering topspin lob into INDPAK's quadrant, scoring what REDCHI claims is a direct hit on Karachi, and what warheadless INDPAK claims is only an indirect hit on Karachi. It's an uneasy moment. A dispute such as this would never occur in the real God's real world, since the truth would be manifest in the actual size of the actual weenie roast in the actual Karachi. But God here is played by Otis P. Lord, and Lord is number crunching so fiendishly at the carts you, trying to confirm the verisimilitude of the peace terms AMNAT and SOVWAR hashing out, that he can't even pretend to have seen where REDCHI's strike against INDPAK landed with respect to Karachi's t-shirt, which is admittedly kind of mashed and wopsed up, though this could be primarily from breezes and feet. And in his lapse of omniscience, cannot see how he's supposed to allocate the relevant INDDIR and SUFDDIR points. Trolsch doesn't know whether to say, "Holy crow," or not. Lord, vexed by a lapse, it's tough to see how any mortal could avoid it, appeals over to Michael Pemulus for an independent ruling. And when Pemulus gravely shakes his white-hatted head, pointing out that Lord is God and either sees or doesn't, in Eschaton, Lord has an intense little crying fit that's made abruptly worse when now J.J. Penn of INDPAK all of a sudden gets the idea to start claiming that now that it's snowing, the snow totally affects blast area and fire area and pulse intensity and maybe also has fallout implications. And he says Lord has to now completely redo everybody's damage parameters before anybody can form realistic strategies from here on out. Pemulus's chair legs shriek and make red-skinned peanuts spill out in a kind of cornucopic cone shape, and he's up in his capacity as a sort of eminence Greece of Eschaton, and ranging up and down just outside the theater's chain-link fencing. giving J.J. Penn the very roughest imaginable side of his tongue. Besides being real sensitive to any theater boundary puncturing threats to the map's integrity, threats that have come up before, and that, as Pemulus sees it, threatens the game's whole sense of animating realism, which realism depends on buying the artifice of a 1,300-meter square of composition tennis court representing the whole rectangular projection of the planet Earth. Pemulus is also a sworn foe of all Penns for all time. It had been J.J. Penn's much older brother, Miles Penn, now 21 and flailing away on the grim Third World Satellite Pro Tour, playing for travel expenses in bleak, dysenteric locales, who, when Pemulus first arrived at ETA at age 11, had christened him Michael Penisless, and had had Pemulus convinced for almost a year that if he pressed on his belly button, his ass would fall off. "It's snowing on the goddamn map, not the territory, you dick," Pemulus yells at Penn, whose lower lip is out and quivering. Pemulus's face is the face of a man who will someday need blood pressure medication, a constitution the tenuant doesn't help one bit. Drolsh is sitting up straight and speaking very intensely and quietly into his headset. Hal, who in his day never wore the beanie and usually portrayed some marginal nation somewhere out in the nuclear boondocks, finds himself more intrigued by Penn's map territory faux pas than upset by it, or even amused. Pemulus turns back to the pavilion and seems to be looking at Hal in some kind of appeal. Jesus! Except, is the territory the real world, quote unquote, though? Axford calls across to Pemulus, who's pacing like the fences between him and some sort of prey. Axford knows quite well Pemulus can be fucked with when he's like this. When he's hot, he always cools down and becomes contrite. Struck tries to yell out at a curtvang on Pemulus, but can't get the megaphone he makes of his hands to fit over the mouth. "The real world's what the map here stands for." Lord lifts his head from the Yushichu and cries over at Axhandle, trying to please Pemulus. "Kinda looks like real world type snow from here, MP," Axford calls out, his forehead still marooned from the coughing fit. Drolsh is trying to describe the distinction between the symbolic map of the gear-littered courts and the global strategic theater it stands for, using all and only sports broadcast cliches. Hal looks from Axhandle to Pemulus to Lord. Struck finally falls out of his chair with a clunk, but his legs are still somehow entangled in the legs of the chair. It starts to snow harder, and dark stars of melt begin to multiply and then merge all over the courts. Otis Lord is trying to type and wipe his nose on his sleeve at the same time. Jay Gopnik and Kay McKenna are running around well outside their assigned quadrants with their tongues outstretched. Real-world snow isn't a factor if it's falling on the fucking map. Ann Kittleplan's crew-cutted head now protrudes from the kind of rugby scrum AMNATs and SOVWAR's heads of state form around Lord's computational food cart. "For Christ's sake, leave us alone!" she shrieks at Pemulus. Drolsh is going, "Oh my," into his headset. Oh Lord is struggling with the cart's protective umbrella, his head's beanie's little white propeller rotating in a rising wind. A light dusting of snow is starting to appear in the player's hair. "It's only real-world snow if it's already in the scenario." Pemulus keeps directing everything at Penn, who hasn't said a word since his original suggestion and is busy sort of casually kicking the Karachi shirt over into the Arabian Sea, clearly hoping the original detonation will get forgotten about in all the meta-theoretical fuss. Pemulus rages along the East Court's western fence. The combination of several tenuate spansules plus Eschaton adrenaline bring his blue-collar Irish right out. He's a muscular but fundamentally physically narrow guy. Head, hands, a sharp little wad of cartilage at the tip of Pemulus's nose. Everything about him seems to taper and come to a point, like a bad El Greco. Hal leans to spit and watches him pace like a caged thing as Lord works feverishly over Enstat's peace terms decision matrix. Hal wonders, not for the first time, whether he might deep down be a secret snob about color issues, and Pemulus, then, whether the fact that he's capable of wondering whether he's a snob attenuates the possibility that he's really a snob. Though Hal hasn't had more than 4 or 5 total very small hits off the public Dubois, this is a prime example of what sometimes is called marijuana thinking. You can tell because Hal's leaned way over to spit, but has gotten lost in a paralytic thought helix, and hasn't yet spit, even though he's right in the bombing position over the NASA glass. It also occurs to him that he finds the real snow, unreal snow snag in the Eschaton extremely abstract, but somehow way more interesting than the Eschaton itself so far. IRLIBSYR strongman Evan Ingersoll, all of 1.3 meters tall, warmed by baby fat and high-calorie cerebral endeavor, has been squatting on his heels like a catcher just west of Damascus, spinning his Rossignol launcher idly in his hand, watching the one-sided exchange between Pemulus and Ingersoll's roommate J.J. Penn, who's now threatening to quit and go in for cocoa if they can't, for once, play Eschaton without the big guys horning in again like always. There's a tiny whirring sound as Ingersoll's mental gears grind. From the duration of the little Sierra Leone summit and the studious blankness on everybody's face, it's pretty clear that SOVWAR and AMNAT are going to come to terms, and the terms are likely to involve SOVWAR agreeing not to go SACPOP against AMNAT in return for AMNAT letting SOVWAR go SACPOP against Ingersoll's IRLIBSYR, because if SOVWAR goes SACPOP against an IRLIBSYR, that can't have many warheads left in the old bucket by now. Ingersoll knows they know. Then SOVWAR will get to rack up a lot of INDDIR without much SUFDDIR, while inflicting much SUFDDIR on IRLIBSYR. That IRLIBSYR will be effectively eliminated as a threat to AMNAT's commanding lead-in points, which is what has the most utility in the old game theoretical matrix right now. The exact utility transformations are too oogly for an Ingersoll who's still grappling with fractions, but he can see clearly that this would be the most remorselessly logical, best interest conducive scenario for both Lamont Chu and especially the sleepster, Peterson, who's hated Ingersoll for months now anyway without any good reason or cause or anything. Ingersoll can just somehow tell. Hal, paralyzed and absorbed, watched Ingersoll bob on his haunches and shift his stick from hand to hand and cerebrate, furiously and logically conclude then that IRLIBSYR's highest possible strategic utility lies in AMNAT and SOVWAR failing to come to terms. Hal can almost visualize a dark light bulb going on above Ingersoll's head. Pemulus is telling Penn that there's a critical distinction between horning in and letting asswipes like Geoffrey Joseph Penn run roughshod over the delimiting boundaries that are Eschaton's very lifeblood. Chu and Peterson are nodding soberly at little things they're saying to each other, while Kitten Plan cracks her knuckles and Postthwaite bounces a warhead idly on his strings. So now, Evan Ingersoll rises from his squat, now only to bend again and take a warhead out of IRLIB-SYR's ordnance bucket, and Hal seems to be the only one who sees Ingersoll line up the vector very carefully with his slim thumb and take a lavish backswing and fire the ball directly at the little circle of super combatant leaders in West Africa. It's not a lob. It flies straight as if shot from a rifle and strikes Anne Kitten Plan right in the back of the head with a loud fuck. She whirls to face east, a hand at the back of her bristly skull, scanning and then locking on Damascus, her face a stony Toltec death mask. Pemulus and Penn and Lord and everyone else all freeze, shocked and silent, so there's just the weird, glittered hiss of falling snow and the sounds of a couple of crows interfacing in the pines over by HMH. The ATH SCME fans are silent, and 4 sweatsock-shaped clouds of exhaust hang motionless over the Sunstrand stacks. Nothing moves. No Eschaton combatant has ever intentionally struck another combatant's physical person with a 5-megaton thermonuclear weapon. No matter how frayed players' nerves, it's never made a lick of sense. A combatant's megatonnage is too precious to waste on personal attacks outside the map. It's been like this unspoken but very basic rule. Anne Kitten Plan is so shocked and enraged that she stands there, transfixed, quivering, her sights locked on Ingersoll and his smoking rossignol. Otis P. Lord feels at his beanie. Ingersoll now makes a show of examining the tiny nails of his left hand and casually suggests that IRLIBSYR has just scored a direct 5-megaton contact burst against OSVWAR's entire launch capacity, namely Air Marshal Anne Kitten Plan, and that plus also AMNAT's own launch capacity, plus both combatants' ordnance and heads of state, all lie well within the blast's kill radius, which, by Ingersoll's rough calculations, extends from the Ivory Coast to the Doubles Alleys, Senegal. Unless, of course, that kill radius is somehow altered by the possible presence of climactic snow, he adds, beaming. Pemulus and Kitten Plan now each let loose with a linear series of anti-Ingersoll invectives that drown each other out and make the tree crows take slow flight. But Otis Lord, who's watched the exchange, ashen, and has called up something relevant on NSTAT's Treemaster meta-decision subdirectory, now to everyone's horror removes from around his neck a shoelace with a little nickel-colored key and bends to the small locked Solander box on the food cart's bottom shelf, and as everyone watches in horror, opens the box and with near ceremonial care exchanges the white beanie on his head for the red beanie that signifies utter global crisis. The dreaded red UGC beanie has been donned by an Eschaton game master only once before, and that was over 3 years ago, when human input error on the NSTAT tallies of aggregate SUFDDIR during a 3-way SAC-POP free-for-all yielded an apparent ignition of the Earth's atmosphere. Now a real-world chill descends over the grainily white-swirled landscape of the nuclear theater.